Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Ketubot Ayin Zayin. I'll just mention it's Rosh Hashanah next week, and it's 2 days. So I'm going to be posting the dapim. Hopefully later today I'll put them up. So you can search them by daf if you want to find them, or if you get our links, we'll send them out. If you're on one of our WhatsApp groups, we're going to send them out to the WhatsApp groups where you can find the dapim for Rosh Hashanah. So if you want to get ahead, I know it's sometimes a little annoying to learn them out of order, but if you want to get ahead, you can do the Rosh Hashanah dapim, so I will put them up hopefully later today. Okay. Okay. Today's daf is sponsored by Shelly and Jerry Gornish in loving memory of their Ayin Zayin, Ketubot Ayin Zayin, their beloved grandson Oz Wilczek. Okay, we're going to start and finish up our sugya from yesterday. If you recall, we were in the middle of discussing this case that Shmuel was quoted first by Rabbi Yehuda and then by Rabbi Yehoshua, his brother, as saying one thing and then saying something else, about a case where we barter the parah for the chamor. You take the parah before, right? We don't know actually, but at some point the chamor is dead. The question is, did the chamor die before or did the chamor die after? Who's supposed to bring the proof? So we say about, right, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he said it's the Baal HaChamor has to prove that the Baal HaChamor has to prove that his Chamor was still alive at the time. Otherwise, he has to return the parah to the original owner. How do we explain that? Because we said there's a weakness in the kinyan, even though normally and really the Baal HaParah is trying to take his animal back, his cow back from the other person. Theoretically, the burden of proof should rely on him. Well, according to Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, no, because there's a weakened, again, this is one of the explanations given, there's a weakened kinyan here. The kinyan might be messed up. There might not have ever been a kinyan. So he doesn't really have a right, even though it's in his property right now. And therefore, the burden of proof relies on him to keep the parah in his hands. Then we brought this contradiction from the case of this tabach and the butcher and the guy selling the meat to the butcher. And we basically said, oh, it doesn't really work because it would have to be in a particular case only it would make sense, would be the same, and therefore they reject it. Therefore comes Rabbi Yehoshua and he says, don't listen to anything my brother says in the name of Shmuel, really what Shmuel said, starting from 7 lines at the bottom, from yesterday's daf, or 8 lines. Kol shenolad safek bereshuto alav haraya. The one whose possession it was in at the time. So in the case of our case, it's the Baal HaParah has the chamor in his possession. And whether it's even in his possession, it almost doesn't matter because they bartered it. So that already puts it on his side. And in the case of the treifa, who is it? It's the butcher. The butcher has it in his possession when he shechs it. And he has to prove, because it's in his possession, he has to prove that it's in order to get his money back from the other guy. So we didn't read this yet inside. So let's get back to it. But before, I won't really want to talk about Tana Tuna Kala. It's the exact same thing with the Kala. Because again, who has to prove it? If she's in her father's house, the burden of proof is on the father. If she's on the husband, the burden of proof is on the husband. That's perfectly fits in well with what he said. So Meitive, now we go back to this bright about the treifa. Now the question is like this. Who has to prove it? So if he already paid the money, right, then what did he say here? It said, Hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. So who's the motzi mechavero? So if I'm the butcher and I already paid the money, and it turns out it was a treifa, I want to get my money back. So the burden of proof is on me, and that works perfect with what Shmuel just said, because I want to prove that the burden of proof is on me because it happened under my guard. I was the butcher. I shechted it. That's when I found it was a treifa. I have to prove that it was a treifa before. If I can't prove it, my tough luck. But what if I didn't pay the money yet? And then that would be right. That would fit with the words of the Braita. I want to get my money back. What if I didn't pay money yet? Then it's on the owner of the animal to prove. So, because remember, the Braita just said, generally, which would mean whoever wants to take the money out. So let's say I buy this animal, but I don't pay for it, right? I buy on credit. I shecht it. Turns out it was a treifa. So according to Rabbi Yehoshua, what would I have to do? I would have to prove it. According to the Braita, if he wants to get his money, he has to prove it, the owner of the animal. So that's what the Gemara is going to ask. If he didn't pay the money yet, and why? According to what Shmuel had said, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, Sveika Birashut Tabachet Yali. The burden of proof is on the one who it happens in his watch. So, what did they answer? Tiyav Tabach Dami. Right? It must be only in a case where he paid the money. To which the Gemara, and if you remember, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we said the opposite. It was only in the case where he didn't pay the money. To which we said, my Pascha. But like the Braita didn't specify only in this case, only in that case, right? It doesn't make sense to say that when the Braita was very general. So my Pascha, like the Gemara is talking about specific cases without, the Braita is talking about specific cases without mentioning it. So they say, yeah, well, in fact, stama de milta, normally when you buy things, what do, right? Normally, kam de lo yav inish zuze, lo yav inish chiyuta, right? If you don't pay the money, then people don't give you the animal. So a normal, typical case, in which case we could say, the Braita is talking about the normal, typical case, where who's the motzi here? The butcher, because the butcher wants to get his money back because he already paid the money. Normally, he wouldn't get the animal if he hadn't paid the money. So that's the end of that sugya. Chachamim omri, b'med dvarim amurim b'mumim shebeseta. So what is this case referring to? The rabbis had said, only if he can only claim this if it was a hidden blemish, right? That's when he can claim. So now Rav Nachman says, I'm Rav Nachman b'nichpeh, she has epileptic fits, kimumim shebeseta dami. It's like something that's hidden. Now this sounds a little strange, because epileptic fits could happen in public, could happen anywhere. To which the Gemara says, well, when he was talking about it, hanimile dikviya le'zman, only someone who has epileptic fits at particular times of day, always. And then they make sure generally that they're in a closed place and nobody actually sees them. But if they don't have a set time about when they happen, then they're just like regular mumim. Okay. And then again, he should have seen them before, and then he can't claim, oh, I didn't know. Okay. As we said, right, there's always that factor comes into play. If he knew and married her anyway, then it's not claims for this was a mistaken trend, mistaken marriage. Mishnah. Now we get to the other side. What about if he has blemishes? And we're going to see a bit of a different standard. Ha'ish shanoldu bo mumim ein kofino tolotzi. If he, now, according to the wording in the Mishnah, we're going to have a whole debate what's the exact wording in the Mishnah, but if he develops a blemish, meaning after the marriage, that's not grounds for divorce. We don't force him to divorce her. We're going to get into the whole thing about forcing divorce and how we can do that. That's going to come up later today. A very relevant topic, right? With all sorts of aguna cases, right? Women who can't get gets. How much do we force the husband? Talk about this. Amar Rashbag, Bamed Varim. Okay, so the first thing sounds pretty simple. Okay, that's not grounds for divorce at all for the woman. However, the first thing is Rashbag limits this and says, well, Amar Rashbag, Bamed Varim Amurim b'mumim aktani, smaller blemishes. Aval b'mumim agdolim, which we're going to have to see in the Gemara how these are defined. But if it's a big blemish, kofino tolotzi, then we can force him to divorce her. The Gemara starts off with, not only does Shimon Gamliel redefine the Mishnah a little bit and say it's not so clear cut, it's not grounds for divorce, it could be. This double reading of the Mishnah, one of the readings is also going to open up much more possibilities. Rabbi Yehuda Tane Noldu. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda has the same version that we have in our Mishnah if we're talking about mums that developed later. Chia Barav Tane Hayu. Chia Barav says if they were, meaning from the beginning. So what's the difference? Wamanda Amar Noldu Koshaken Hayu. If it's a new blemish that appeared and it's not grounds for divorce, then of course, if it was there from the beginning, it's certainly not grounds for divorce because the assumption is she knew about it, married him anyway, and said, I don't care, right? It doesn't bother me. So of course, she can't claim later, oh, I want to get divorced because of it. Tikasafra v'kibla, because she knew it and accepted it. Manda Amar Hayu, but if you say that the Mishnah says she can't use this as grounds for divorce if he had them from before, well, then you would say, aval noldu lo, but if they develop later, then that would be grounds for divorce because she could say, I didn't know about them. I didn't marry him knowing this was going to happen to him. Now that this happened to him, I can't bear to be married to him anymore. Tonight, Amar Shimon Gamliel. So now they're going to say, wait, let's try to use the wording of our Mishnah to try to prove one or the other. So when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel comes and says, only small blemishes, but if they're large blemishes, then we do force him. That only works if you say no do. They develop later. And then you could say, okay, well, if a blemish develops later, it really depends. Is it large or is it small? If it's large and very serious, then that could be grounds for divorce. But lemant amal hayu, malik doli malik tanim, if it already was there from the beginning and she knew about it and she married him anyway, it shouldn't make a difference. Doli tanim, ha sabra v'kibla, she accepted it. So it doesn't make a difference. So it doesn't really make sense that the Mishnah is talking about a case where she already knew from before. Kisvurai, so they say, no, you could explain it that way as well. Kisvurai shechola lekabel, v'achshav ein chola lekabel, when it comes to a big blemish, so she thought that she can handle it, but it turns out she didn't realize what it was going to be like married to someone with this gigantic blemish, and she could then claim, I didn't realize, and I want to get a divorce now, and we can force him to divorce her. Now we get to Elu He Mumim Gdolim. What are these Mumim Gdolim? Perush Rashbag, Gigon Nismeit Eino Nikta'a Yado Nishbara Raglo. Like he got blinded in one eye, he lost a hand, he lost a leg. Itma. Rabbi Abba Bar Yaakov Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now Rabbi Abba, it said, the Rabbi Abba Bar Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Halacha Ke Rashbag, which is very interesting. Right? He paskins like Rashbag, basically saying, right, the Tanakama had seemed to limit the ability of the woman, and Rashbag basically gives her more possibilities of her claiming that she wants to divorce him. So Rabbi Abba Bar Yaakov now says the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have a side issue with this, which is kind of interesting issue. But before we get there, we're going to see that Rava Amar Rav Nachman halacha k'divrei chachamim. So we have two different piskei halacha opposite. Now they want to ask. Rabbi Abba Bar Yaakov says Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha is like Rashbag in our Mishnah. Does it really make sense to say that Rabbi Yochanan said this? And the reason is not going to be because he doesn't hold like Rashbag. The reason is going to be because it's obvious he holds like Rashbag. You didn't even need to tell us this, because there's a general principle Rabbi Yochanan said elsewhere. This was passed down by Rabbi Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Anytime you see Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in our Mishnah disagreeing with Tanakama, we always hold like him. Chutz mi erev Arev, Seidan, Uraya Achona. Other than three cases. Okay, what are these three cases? These are three cases we don't hold like Rashbag. One is if you're a guarantor for a loan, the creditor can't go directly to the guarantor unless the borrower has no money. If the borrower has any kind of money, he has to demand it from the borrower, not from the guarantor. Apparently, we don't hold like him. Saidan is if it was actually Saidan is a place in Lebanon. It's a story that happened. It's a Mishnah in Gitin, I think it's Ayin Daled, about if he gives her a get upon condition, like we've learned that, all these stipulations. And there was a case that happened in Saidan where he said, here's your get on the condition that you return to me my cloak, and then the cloak got lost. So now she can't fulfill the condition. So the rabbis had said in that case, according to Rashbag, that she returns the value of the cloak. So there we don't hold like Rashbag either. And that will be the fulfillment of the Tanai. Rayachrona is an interesting case. The guy comes to court and says, they say, bring witnesses. He says, I don't have witnesses. Bring a proof. I don't have a proof. And then he comes back later and has witnesses or has a proof. So Tanakama says, we don't believe him, right? If he had witnesses, he would have said, I have witnesses. All of a sudden he has witnesses. He must have gone and hired people to be witnesses. Comes Rashbag and he says, what do you mean? Like, poor guy. What if he didn't have witnesses? And then it turns out he finds out later that there's witnesses. What, you're not going to let them testify on his behalf? So he goes to say, you can, right? They call it Rayach or not, because there's three machlokot about these kind of cases in the Mishnah between Tanakam and Rashbag. And this was the last case. And we don't hold like Rashbag in the last case. So the main question is, why did Rabbi Abba say that Rabbi Yochanan said, the halacha is like Rashbag, if we know he always holds like Rashbag other than three cases, and this is not one of the three cases? To which they answer, Amorayin Rabbi Yochanan. There's a machlokah between Amorayin, what Rabbi Yochanan held, whether he always holds like Rashbag or not necessarily. And because of that, Rabbi Abba Bar Yaakov obviously didn't hold like Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said this, but Rabbi Abba didn't think that. So he wanted to specify every time we hold like Rashbag. Mishnah. Elu shekofino tola hutzi. Now, after we said that if he has a mum, right, we can't force him to divorce her, except if it's a mum gadol, according to Rashbag. But now we say, but there are a bunch where we do force. What are these cases? Mukat shchin, if he has boils on his body. Ubal polypus, it sounds like polyps. We'll talk about that later. Mikametz, which we don't yet know what it is. Mitzaref nechoshet, he's a copper welder. Haborsi, he works as a tanner. Okay, these were jobs that basically caused bad odors in people. Okay, they smell really bad, and therefore she can't live with the bad smell. Bein shayu, okay, except for the mukat shchin and the Baal polypus, but the other ones are smell related. Even the Baal polypus we're going to see is also smell related. Bein shayu ad shalom nisu, ubein mishen nisu noldu. It doesn't matter whether they were there from the beginning and she said I can marry him anyway. She realized how bad it was, or whether she married him and then it happened. Al kulam amal Rabbi Meir, al papi she'it naima. Even if he made a condition with her about it, she could say, she could say, listen, I thought I could handle this, but I really can't. All of them, if she accepted it, tough luck on her. You can't use this as grounds for divorce. Now, obviously, if he wants to divorce her, he can, but the point is, you can't force him to divorce her. The mukat shchin is a whole separate issue from all the rest of them. It has nothing to do with her being disgusted by it, or at least not only, but what the problem is like this. When they have relations, it causes his skin to shed and it destroys his body, which means that they basically can't have relations. Now, again, that's a basic part of marriage. So if they can't have relations, then she can demand divorce. So that's the only case that's different than the others, according to the rabbis, right? He distinguishes and says, that's the only case that's grounds for divorce. The others are not, if she accepted it. There was a case, though, in Sidon where there was a borsi, this is the same place we were talking about before, where there was a tanner who died. And his brother was a tanner, okay, family business. Anyway, she falls to Yibum to the brother. Vayalo ach borsi, so his brother was also. She could claim, listen, I can't do Yibum with you because you're a borsi. He could say, what do you mean? My brother was also. She said, yeah, but I loved your brother and I was willing to get over it because I loved him. But you, I don't have those same feelings, so I'm not willing to marry you because you have this terrible smell, right? Which shows the whole, and obviously I didn't state this, but it's obvious because we talked about this already, of the women, again, wanted to be married and therefore they were willing to stay married even though there were these mumim, and that affects the halacha, since the women in general were more okay to kind of stay married. Therefore, probably that affected the rabbis' push to say, oh, we don't force him to give a get because most women are okay with this, right? Unless they state otherwise. And then, then it depends on the situation, it depends on what your opinion is about whether we'll agree or not, whether we allow you to make a claim or not, right? We see all sorts of different opinions about this. Not so clear cut. Now the Gemara wants to know, what are all these things mentioned in the Mishnah? My Baal polypus, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, reach hachotem. It's a bad smell, a foul odor in the nose, the nostrils. B'matnita tan in a bright, they say reach hapeh. It's a bad breath. Rav Asi mani ipcha. He said it's flipped. It's the bright that says foul odor in the nostrils, and it's Shmuel who said bad breath. Right? So it's not a huge difference, but it's just who said what. He made a siman to remember. Shmuel pasuk pume mikule pirkin. Shmuel doesn't stop talking about this entire parak. So what does that mean? Talking mouth. That's how you connect Shmuel with the mouth, and therefore he must have said reach hapeh. That was how he remembered his version. V'hamekametz, my mekametz, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, zeh hamekabetz soat klavim. That's someone who gathers all the dung, okay, of the dogs. Okay, you could use some of that in my neighborhood. Okay. Now you could see why that would be a job that would make you smell bad. Wait a minute. There's a bright that contradicts this. It says mikametze borsi. That's a tanner. So which the Gemara says, well, if you want to right now, again, Rabbi Yehuda said it's someone who collects the dung of the dogs. The Braita says it's a borsi. That seems to go against. But he says, as a response, according to you, you think it's a borsi. Well, tikshelach matnitim. Right? You're trying to prove from the Braita it's a borsi, but then the Mishnah makes no sense because the Mishnah listed hamekametz, hamitzaref nechoshet, v'haborsi. So you can't possibly say that mekametz is borsi, then borsi is mentioned twice. It makes no sense. So bishlam amanitin lo kashin. The Braita is not so difficult, right? The Mishnah. Kam beborsi gadol, kam beborsi katan. Whether you're a tanner of, I assume it means large animals or small animals. Right? Yeah, I don't know. Shu ani v'yesh lo orot ma'at. I see. Rashi says borsi katan is a poor, right? He is a poor borsi, so he doesn't have a lot, right? He has a small business. If his business is small, it's not so, right? It's not such a big, it's not going to smell so bad. Ela Rabbi Yehuda kasha. But Rabbi Yehuda, how are you going to explain it? If the Braita says borsi, then it's borsi. Tanai detani makamet borsi yesh omrim zeh makamet soat klavi. Says no. I'll show you another Braita says there's a machloket about it. I just don't hold by that Braita. Okay, I hold by the other opinion. Hamitzaref nechoshet v'haborsi. My mitzaref nechoshet. What does this mean? Rav Ashi Amar chash ledude. He's someone who makes kettles. So he pounds the copper to make the kettles, and that causes a bad smell. He mines copper. That's what causes it to be, have a foul smell. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Chanina will bring a Braita to support his opinion, and that supports his opinion. Amarav. Now we move into other issues with husbands and reasons for divorce. Amarav. You have a husband who says, forget about that he has some physical blemish on his body. This is more emotional abuse. He says or maybe you could call this physical abuse, not physical as in physically abusing, but taking away some physical need of hers, which is I'm not going to support you at all, not giving you food, not sustenance. He has to divorce her and give her ketubah money. Okay, because he's abusing her basically, and he's not giving her the privileges of marriage. So Rabbi Elazar went. Okay, Rabbi Elazar is an Emorah in Eretz Yisrael, but he started in the beginning of his career with learning with Rav and Shmuel. Then he moved to Israel and became Rabbi Yochanan's Talmid Mubhak, right, his main student. Anyway, he goes and says this before Shmuel. This is important for the story because first he learns it with Rav, then he goes to say what Rav said to Shmuel. Shmuel's response is, Aksua sare le'elazar. Feed animal food, which is barley. Feed barley to Elazar. Ad shekofino tolotzi yechapu lazun. It's interesting, is punishing him with food. Right? When he's relating to this food issue, this person who won't give food to his wife, he says, what are you, crazy? We're going to force him to give a get? No, we're going to force him to feed her. In other words, force him to do his basic need. Now, you might say, okay, there's two ways to look at this. One is he's hesitant to force divorce, which we see in the courts nowadays. They're very hesitant to issue what we call a chiyuv get that we've talked about a number of times, which is they say to the husband, you have to give her a get, and then they can start instituting sanctions on him. So one is maybe he's just hesitant to do that and says, let's rectify the problem before we do that. The other might be actually to protect the woman, because the woman might prefer to stay married. Again, it's the question. And it's a question, maybe it's different in those days, but maybe she'd prefer that you resolve the issue and she stay married than be a divorcee on the street trying to find another husband. So it could be he's trying to protect the woman in this. It's a good question, right? Whether you're quick to divorce or say, maybe try to resolve it. So two ways to look at what he says, but he's very strong about this. You can see by his language, the way he talks to Elazar, you're deserving to eat barley for saying such a ridiculous thing. And really, you should just force him to feed her. Rav, so why wouldn't Rav say that? This is what you or I would be prone to say probably, which is, okay, so let's imagine the scenario. The guy's a real, not a great guy or pretty bad guy, that he won't feed his wife. So she'll bring him to court. They'll force him to give her food. A year later, he'll do the same thing. Or a month later, he'll do the same thing. Right? A woman doesn't want to live with the kind of person who would do this. It's obviously indicative of what kind of person he is. And it's unfair to make her live with a snake, basically, that, he could do this at any time. You wouldn't live with a snake in a glove, right? We're in a small space. Kiselik Rabbi Zera. The story continues. When Rabbi Zera goes up to Israel, okay, this is why I told you the story is interesting in terms of first Rabbi Elazar learned in Babylonia, and then he moves to Israel. Also, Rabbi Zera goes to Israel. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet. You heard him quoting in the name of Rabbi Yochanan the exact same halacha as Rav. To which Rabbi Zera says to him, on this issue, they fed barley, even though they didn't really literally feed him, but they fed barley to Elazar on this issue. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't do this. Okay, so there's this big debate here, and you can see how strong they were about their opinions about whether you force the husband to give a get or you don't force. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Asi. Ein ma'asin el psula. Ma'asin is what we call a get meuseh, an ayin and a sin. It means to force. Okay, it's when we force the husband to give a get. And force to the extent, right? How can we force? We'll talk about it soon. Can you use physical, beat him up, or not? So we only force gets for psulo. That means, okay, we're going to see right now. When I said this in front of Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda said, Kigon almana l'kohen gadol, if you're a widow married to a kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen idiot, only for forbidden marriages, not for issues like we're talking about. Mamzeret nitina Yisrael, if somebody married a mamzeret, bat Yisrael and nitinu l'mamzer, if she was a bat Yisrael, but she married a mamzer or a natin, aval nasa isha. Okay, so now those are cases you can force again, but this case you can't. For example, nasa isha v'shahayma eser shlenim v'lo yalda, if they couldn't have children for 10 years, ein kofinoto. We don't force them to give a divorce. However, Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi Amar Shmuel, he says in the name of Shmuel differently. Okay, there's a debate what Shmuel held about this. Even in that case, we force divorce. Okay, now it's a very complicated issue, this whole 10 years, because it's not clear whether the problem lies with him or the problem lies with her, right? The obvious problem is he can't fulfill his mitzvah, pru revu. Some people say he can take another wife, right? So you don't need to divorce, even though they were pretty much discouraging of taking another wife. Obviously, nowadays you can't do that. It's not necessarily that you'll find someone to marry. It's not necessarily you'll marry someone who will be able to give you children, right? Maybe the problem's with him. It's not necessarily, you might not have a boy and a girl, right? Some people don't ever end up with a boy and a girl and fulfilling their mitzvah anyway. So it's a bit of a strange, complicated topic, this whole thing, and obviously very emotionally complicated. Not even, important to address that as well. Tanan. So this is machloket about whether Shmuel thinks you can force divorce in that case or not. So now they say, let's try to figure out who's right. Tanan. Elu shekofino tolotzi. Look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, these are the people we force to divorce their wives. Mukachchim, Baal Polipus, etc. Bishlam al Rav Asi. Now, Rav Asi makes sense. Why? Because what did Rav Asi say? We can force for cases of psul chitun, right? Where they can't get married by Jewish law. So, Rabbanit ktani, doraita lo ktani. All those things don't appear in our Mishnah. Why? Because those are all Torah law, and this is rabbinic. And then the case of not having children isn't here, even though that's also rabbinic. There's certainly no Torah requirement. It's rabbinic, but that's not here because you actually don't force divorce, and that makes perfect sense. But according to Rav Tachli Bar-Avimi, since that's D'Rabbanan and our Mishnah is D'Rabbanan, it should have mentioned all the cases that are rabbinic, should have listed that in our Mishnah. Now you could say that wasn't really our topic. Our topic is mumim, and this, whether this is a mum or not, maybe would, I don't know, it's a good question. Anyway, Amar Rav Nachman lo kashya habamile habashote. This is an interesting answer. It's even more interesting the response to this answer, but the reason it's not mentioned is if you can't have children for 10 years, so the rabbis talk to you about saying, maybe you should divorce her. But they don't force it. They only force it with words. They don't force it with whips and, beating you. Whereas the other cases, if the husband won't give the get, we beat him. Here's where you see that you can beat the husband if he doesn't do this. Matkev, right, if he's supposed to give a get, although basically that gets neutralized some or kind of in halacha, they basically minimize this and they really do not allow beatings only in extreme cases. They don't really allow it for normal cases. It's a whole big issue nowadays. Like when they put sanctions on the husband, what kind of sanctions they could put on? There's a case right now of a Mr. get where they tried to not let him bury his father. And then he basically committed, okay, I'll give the get if you let me bury my father. They buried the father and then he didn't give the get. And if you're familiar with the case, and now his mother's very ill and they're trying to basically use it again, basically dupe them, trying to use it again and say, we're not going to let you bury the mother. It actually comes up in the Shulchan Aruch about not burying, we can sanction them by not letting them bury their children. So Rav Asher Weiss nowadays, he basically said we can apply this in this case to not burying the parents as well. That's a sanction we can put on him in order, but then he limits it to only if the parents were supportive of him not giving the divorce. If the parents were against him and tried to get him to give the divorce, then you can't penalize the parents. It's a crazy situation to say we're not going to bury your parents. Right on the other hand, it's a good tool to use up against him. It's all a question of what sanctions we can use. It's a very interesting sugi here. So Matkapla Rabbi Abba says, wait a minute. You want to say that we're going to try to force him with words. But we all know, it's a pasuk of Mishlei, right? No one's going to be whipped into shape by words. That just doesn't work. So that's a useless mechanism. Ella Amar Rabbi Abba, so Rabbi Abba says, okay, fine. Hava shofar. Both cases you can use physical force. Hatam ki amra havina behadei shavkina. Hacha af agav da amrina havina behadei lo shavkina. Okay, if she says, 1 second, Havina, I just forgot what this is for a second. Havina Bahadei. Right. If she says, right now I remember, if she says, I'm going to stay with him, then we let her. That's for all the other cases, like the Mukat Shchin and all that. But Hacha, Afagav, but when it comes to the case of 10 years where they haven't had children, since he wants to, right, since basically they're not having children, Lo Shafkinala. She can't say, I'm willing to stay married to him anyway. That's the distinction between the cases, and that's why it's not mentioned in our Mishnah. To which they say, wait a minute, though, that doesn't make sense. Remember we said in the Mishnah, she can't, about a mukat shchin, say, I don't care, I'll stay married to him. Why? Because it destroys his body by having relations, and then she'll be in a, she can't stay married to him when it's forbidden for her to have relations with him. Vikatane, right? And yet it's listed. So that's not a good distinction. So they say, no, it is. Because there's still a distinction. There is a case where she could stay married to this mukat shchin without having relations with him when she says the following. Hatam ki amra dayarana behadei besahadei. I'm going to live with him. I want to stay married to him. I'm going to live with him, but we're not going to have relations. And how can I prove it? I'm going to live with witnesses in our house that will testify that we don't sleep together. Then shavkinala. Then she can actually stay married to him. Like she's basically willing to give up on her owner. She doesn't care. Hacha afagav. But when it comes to the case of the 10 years, afagav de amr dayarana bahade besade. Even though she says I'm going to live with him with witnesses, lo shavkinala. Because again, that's not the issue here. Okay. Now we're going to get into something that's going to take us to the end of the daf, which is the end of the chapter, and we're going to get into two very interesting stories. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yosef, Sachli zakenach me'an Anshe Yerushalayim, 24 mukei shchinim. Okay, there was an elderly man from Anshe Yerushalayim who told me that there's 24 types of mukat shchin, which are boils. V'kulam amru chachamim tashmish kasher lehem. All of them, they can't have relations. Right? It destroys their body. Uba'alei ra'atan kashem mikulam. Okay, this thing called ba'alei ra'atan, which could possibly be leprosy, is the worst of them all. Mimai have, what causes this? Okay, this is classic. The Gemara wants to know what causes these things. If you do bloodletting, which was something they did for health reasons, and you have relations right after, you'll have weaker children. If the husband and wife both bloodlet and then have relations, that's what causes these children to be Baalei Ra'atan. He says, but this is only if you don't eat anything after doing the bloodletting before having relations. But if you eat something, the whole point was that the bloodletting was healthy for your body, but in the very short term, it weakens you, and having relations would be even worse. And therefore, they discourage people from doing it by saying you'll have these children who Baalei Ra'atan. But then, of course, they quote this as saying that's how the Baalei Ra'atan are created by parents who did the following, even though not necessarily. My simane. How do you know? What's a mark of a person who's Baalei Ra'atan? How do you know? Dolphin Eine, their eyes are dripping with, they're always, everything's dripping, basically. We're going to have their eyes, Daive Nechire, their nostrils, Aitale Pume, there's saliva coming out of their mouth, Uramu Didve Ilave. And there's they end up with a lot of bees surrounding them. Maya Sute, what's their cure? And now, going to get a really strange description of how to cure. We always know these cures are kind of strange. In the end, it's going to come down to that they assume one of the zvuvim got into the brain, and you have to basically go in and do surgery, brain surgery. So you're basically going to get a description how they did brain surgery in their days. It's kind of crazy to think about. Okay, Amar Abai, Pila Viludana, which are types of grass. You take Girda de Agoza, the scrapings of the walnuts, Girda de Ashpa, the scrapings of a smooth hide of an animal, Kleel Malka, which they say is Artemisia, and mitafla de dikla sumaka. You take the I have to remember, it's something from a date. I see, Ruth, you're telling me it's a lily. So yeah, in general, I find the Koran has the best translations for all these things that are actual things. Okay, Artemisia is, they say here, it grows in plains and sandy areas and bears small flowers. An essential oil has been used as medicine from ancient times. There's all these descriptions of what exactly these are. So if you're interested in botany and all that, they have really good footnotes in the Koran. I'm not going to spend our time in it because we have some really interesting stories coming up. Anyway, we have, so you take this klil malka, you take the calyx of a red date palm, okay, and then you cook them all together. We're going to read that. Shalik lebahade adade, cook them together. Ma'ayala lebeta deshisha, you bring them into a house made of marble, which basically means there's no wind there. We've talked about this a bunch of times. It comes up. You want a place without wind. Vilo ika beta deshisha, if you don't have that. Ma'ayala lebeta deshev lebene va'ariche, has 7 layers of stones, of bricks. Vinatil etzlat me'akase al reshe, you pour 300 cups of this substance on his head. Until it's very soft on the top of his head. You can then open it up. You take 4 myrtle branches. You basically take every leg of the bee and put it on a myrtle branch. And then you pick it out with a tweezer. And then you roast it, like you burn it, singe it. Because if not, it'll go right back in. Okay, interesting description. Tov, machris Rabbi Yochanan. Now this is going to sound very much like COVID, okay? Stay far away from the zvuvim because they have with it the disease on it and they can transmit the disease. Rabbi he wouldn't stand anywhere where there was the wind, where like a wind was blowing from one of these people that were Baalei Ratan, right? This is how much, right? They wore masks, right? They didn't say mask, but basically stay far away from the wind coming from where this Baalei Ratan were. Rabbi Elazar lo ayal ba'ole, he wouldn't go into a tent. Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, lo va'achli mi beid ha'umavo, they wouldn't eat an egg that came out of an alleyway where in that alleyway somewhere was someone who had this disease. However, and here comes the big lead into our story. There was one person who didn't care. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi mikarech behu, which means literally he stuck to them, as opposed to, right, like in Hebrew the word is davak, which is the same word used for it's midabek, it's contagious. Okay, he stuck with these people, va'asik b'Torah, and he would teach them Torah. Right? If everyone stays away from them, these poor people will have no way to learn. He was willing to risk his life. Amar, he said the following: Ayelet ahavim v'yalat chen, which is a description of it's understood to be an allegory for the Torah. Im chen ma'aleh alomdeha agune lo magna. If it's going to bring grace to its learners, should it not protect them as well? So therefore, I'm protected by learning, by teaching Torah. So what was his reward? When he died, God said, do whatever he wants. It was his time to die. God says, go see what he wants, how he wants to die. So Malach HaMavet appears to him. By the way, there's a Shuli wrote all about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and what other things about him in this week's flashback, so worthwhile reading. Anyway, so Yehoshua ben Levi says to him, I want to see the place where I'm going to be in Gan Eden. He said, great, no problem. Havli sakinech, but give me your knife, he asked. I'm scared to walk with you. You might kill me on the way. Give me your knife. He says, okay, I'll give you my knife. When he got there, Dalye, he lifts him up, right? He picks him up so he could see into heaven. He says, that's your spot right there. Shval, Yehoshua ben Levi jumps, he falls on the other side of Gan Eden. The Malach HaMavet tries to pull him up. He says, I swear I'm not coming. I'm here. Okay, basically what happens is he dies without dying, right? He gets to heaven without having gone through death. Okay, like Eliyahu and Avi, right? If Eliyahu in Melachim, right, goes up to the heavens, he doesn't even really die. He's basically averted death. And he's straight in heaven already. Amar kutshabrichu. So the question is this swear a good swear? Now this is interesting because we're in the chapter of nidarim, swears, right? And if the woman takes on a neder and doesn't keep it, does keep it, right? All this stuff. So what does God say? If any time in his life he undid a swear or didn't keep to what he swore, then he's going back. Ilo lo nehadar, but if not, he's not going back. And in fact, he had never taken any swears in his life that he didn't keep or that he tried to undo, and therefore he gets to stay. So now comes Malach Hamav, and Amalei Havli Sakinai, give me my knife back. Lo avakayadva, he wouldn't give it to him. Nafka bat kala, so a bat kol comes down from the heavens. Va'amrele hav niale de mitba'ale b'liyata. Give it to him because he needs it. Like that's his job. He can't do his job without, he needs it. So he needed to anyway. That's what happens. Okay, we're going to compare. I'll wait for the analysis till we get to the second story. Anyway, next. Machriz Eliyahu Kameh. So Eliyahu now announces, Panu makom lebar Levi, Panu makom lebar Levi. Make way, this great man has come in to Ben Levi. His name is Yehoshua ben Levi. Azal eshkachei Rabbi Yehoshua bar Yochai, Daviyativ al tzlat asar tachtis ted Pisa. He sees Rabbi Yehoshua bar Yochai, who's on 13 golden stools, right? This is, these magnificent stories they talk about in heaven. 13 golden stools. Amar le atu bar Levi. He says, are you the one they're talking about? Amar le hain. He says, yes. Nira tak keshet biyamecha. Did you ever see a rainbow? Amar le hain. He said, yes. Im ken yeta bar Levi. If not, you must not be bar Levi. If you saw a rainbow, because a rainbow is a sign that God wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and he stopped himself because of the promise, but it's a sign that things were bad. And if you were this great person, you would have protected all the people. Velohi happens, it wasn't true. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi lied. He really never saw a rainbow. And obviously he was Ben Levi. Tilo avimidi, okay, it really never happened. Elasavar, but why did he lie? Lo echzi tivuta l'nafshi. He was uncomfortable with, he wanted him not to really think he was Ben Levi. He couldn't, right? It's interesting. Why did he say you're Ben Levi? And he said, yes, I am. But then he realizes, maybe he didn't realize what that meant. Maybe he didn't hear Eliyahu making this big announcement of him coming. Once he realized that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Yochai was trying to test him, are you this great man? He said, I'll be modest about it and I'll lie. Next story. And this is the foil story, okay? Yonah Frankel has an excellent comparison of the two stories and what the moral is. Okay, so let's listen to the next story and start thinking about the comparison of the two stories. Rabbi Chanina bar Papa Shush ben Ehav. He was a friend, a buddy of the Malach HaMavet, which maybe already gives you an indication that he's not the greatest person, okay? Because who hangs out with the Malach HaMavet, right? Okay, again, they say the Malach HaMavet do whatever he wants. So he obviously was a pretty good guy. Same thing happens. Malach HaMavet goes to him, appears to him. Shivki taltin yomin adin hadran tamudan. I want to review my Torah for 30 days. Give me 30 days more, please. Why? Because they say, better is the person who comes here when he's got all of his learning under his belt, knows everything. Shavke, so he leaves him alone for 30 days. He goes and appears to him after 30 days. He says, go show me the spot in Gan Eden where I'm going to be. He says, sure, no problem. Havli sakinech, same story. Give me your knife. What, you want to do what your friend did to me? This is like the Torah stories where they each make mention of the other. What you want to do what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi did? No way, no how. I did Sefer Torah v'chazeh. Go take out a Sefer Torah and show me. Is there anything in the Torah that I didn't do? So I'm deserving of that too. Did you sit and learn Torah with the Baalei Ra'atan? That's what got Yehoshua ben Levi in there. But you didn't. You learned Torah, maybe you kept all the mitzvot, but you weren't teaching Torah to these people who no one would teach. Afilu hachi, even so, he didn't get what he wanted, but there was a pillar of fire between him and everybody else. And we know that there's only one or two in a generation where that would happen to. We've seen this story before of a pillar of fire being there for some great rabbi. Not so long ago, we saw this anyway. Krav l'gabei Rabbi Alexandri. It was, by the way, in those stories of the Torah learners who left their houses. Krav l'gabei Rabbi Alexandri. Now, what's the problem? The problem is no one could bury him because of this pillar of fire. So they had a problem. It was a good thing, but it was a bad thing. So Rabbi Alexandri goes to him and says, and they're talking to the dead body, they say, do respect of the rabbis. You're a rabbi, let us bury you. Lo eshkach. He didn't listen. Do it for your father's respect. Lo eshkach. He didn't listen. Do for your own kavod. Istalik. The amud, the pillar of fire, disappears. Amar Abai la fuke miman de lo kiyem. Okay, in other words, this amud was to separate between the people who kept the Torah and the people who didn't keep the Torah. Amale Rav Ada bar Matna la fuke mimar de lo itle ma'akal igare. No, it was to separate between the people who didn't put up a ma'akeh, what do you call it, a fence on their roofs so the people won't fall off the roof. And he was trying to say to Abaye, because you don't have a fence on your roof, okay? Velohi, but it's not really true. Again, it wasn't really true. Mihave havya, he actually had put up a fence on his roof, but the wind came and blew it away at that moment, and therefore it looked like he didn't have a fence on his roof. Okay, this seems totally not connected, but we'll talk about it in a minute. Anyway, last thing before I kind of add, so that way if you don't want to listen to my analysis, you can stop here. I know I'm going a little over. Okay, why don't we have these kind of people anymore? It's because they eat beets and they drink this hizmi beer. Rabbi Yochanan, he adds that they also bathe in the Euphrates, and that cures them from this having this disease or prevents them from having it. With that, Hadran. Okay, what's with these two stories now? So the contrast, and Yonah Frankel sets this up very beautifully in his book, Sipur Agadach, Tochem B'tzura. He basically says, and you know, his stuff is great because once you see it, it's so obvious in the story. Rabbi Shlomo Levi, his greatness is that he does for other people, as opposed to Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa, where all his learning is all for his own self, kavod, right? He says, I did all the Torah, right? But he didn't teach others. He wants, right, in the end, the pillar of fire, the only thing he's convinced by is do it for your own respect. That seems to be the only thing that interests him, whereas Rabbi Shlomo Levi is the opposite. He's not looking for respect at all. He lies out of try to not get respect. And what's interesting about him lying, why is the test, did he keep his shvuot? Because he's tricking all along this story. He tricks the Malach HaMavet. He lies to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But those are all for good reasons. But in the end, he's a super honest person, and that's the test. In the end, it's his honesty that keeps him. But even though, like, there's honesty here, there's humility, the real main thing, focus on him, is that he does for others. What's the proof? He takes the knife, and why did he take the knife? Not because he was scared. He wanted to take the knife ultimately to not let the Malach HaMavet get to people. And if you think about it, he was a healer. He was trying to heal them through learning Torah. So his whole thing was trying to heal these other people. And how does, in the end, he tries to, he sees the Malach HaMavet as the enemy because he's the one kind of getting to these people who are sick. So he's trying to kind of heal people by taking away the powers of the Malach HaMavet. So his lying and tricking is only to do for others. And that's what makes him such a great person. Whereas Chanina Bar Papa is using his Torah. It's kind of going back to all those Torah stories of the rabbis who left their houses for so many years, right? It's how you learn Torah. It's not Torah itself could be dangerous. You could use it for the wrong purposes. And then you want to connect it to this chapter, and it's all about husband and wife and making vows and commitments and all that. And I think that it's interesting that, Rabbi Shlomo Levi did something that people weren't willing to do, but he saw a value in it. And that, yes, you can try to divorce, and yes, you can, and what grounds do you have for divorce and all that. But, maybe there's something to making the peace and trying to work things out and trying to live together, even, make connections that maybe are complicated, but make them work. Maybe there's something to be said for that, for keeping your word, right? For not all about yourself, right? That's what they all say about relationships, right? Do for others, create better communication. Anyway, interesting story. There's a lot more to be said for it, but that's it for today. Have a great day, everyone. We will start chapter 8 tomorrow.